Hey nurses, have you been scratching your head over which English test you actually need to take to work and migrate in Australia? Well, maybe you've heard something about AHPRA, then you've heard something from a friend, then you got totally different advice when it comes to your visa. Well, this episode is just for you. Today, we're going to break down the new English language requirements for nurses in 2025. We'll talk about what has changed for AHPRA in March this year, and what's also changed for migration purposes this year, whether that's employer-sponsored visas or you're looking at a points-based skilled visa. And I want to talk about the biggest mistakes that we see nurses make that can lead to costly delays or even visa refusals. If you haven't met me before, I'm Rhea Fawole. I am your host of Making Australian Migration Easy. I'm a principal lawyer of Solving Migration, an Australian immigration law firm. It's the only law firm in Australia that's dedicated solely to helping nurses and healthcare professionals to migrate successfully and as well as obtain their registration. I spent more than 20 years working inside the Australian government, including 12 years as a senior manager in the Department of Home Affairs, that's immigration in Australia, and later as a director in the Department of Health and Ageing. So I know exactly how the system works, both from the health regulation and the migration law side of things. So the team that I have use all of this experience in our day-to-day to guide nurses just like you through this maze. Okay, now let's dive in. In today's episode, we'll cover three big areas. Firstly, the updated AHPRA English test requirements that were introduced in March 2025. Then we're going to talk about the migration English test rules, including what's needed for employer-sponsored visas and points-based visas, and some of those changes that came in this year as well. Then we're lastly going to talk about the common mistakes and myths that trip nurses up and why getting the preparation and strategy right really matters when it comes to English preparation. Now, before we start, let me give you a quick pre-frame. For years, I've seen nurses assume that once they pass one English test that they're fine. And honestly, that assumption has caused more delays and wasted money and shattered dreams than anything else that I can see in the migration processes. Truth is, when it comes to AHPRA and it comes to migration, they're actually two totally different systems. They have different rules, different accepted tests, different scoring requirements, and unless you treat them separately, then you actually risk being caught out. So with that in mind, let's get into the detail. So the first topic, as I said, we're going to talk about is AHPRA's English test requirements. So back in March 2025, the Nursing Midwifery Board of Australia introduced updated English testing requirements for your AHPRA registration. And this is important because if you want to work as a nurse in Australia, you must have registration with AHPRA first. Even if you have a visa, without AHPRA, you can't work as a nurse in Australia. So what has changed? The updated rules brought in AHPRA into line with similar jurisdictions. When I say that, I mean other countries, such as the UK, US, and New Zealand. Now you have to meet very specific minimum scores in different bands of the tests. There's no averaging it out if you miss one band. You need to meet the standard. There are actually 5 different accepted tests. The IELTS Academic, remember, not the general. That stands for the International English Language Testing System. So this academic version, you need to score 7.0 in listening, reading, and speaking, and a minimum of 6.5 in writing. Then there's the OET, that's the Occupational English Test. It requires a minimum of B in listening, reading, and speaking, and at least a C+ in writing. Then we've got the PTE Academic, the Pearson Test of English, the academic version. That needs 65 in listening, speaking, and reading, and a minimum of 58 in writing. For the TOEFL IVIT, that's the test of English as a foreign language, internet-based, that's at least 24 in listening and reading, 23 in speaking, and 21 in writing. For the Cambridge, the C1 Advanced, which is also known as the Cambridge English Test, that's at least 185 in listening, speaking, and reading, and 176 in writing. All tests must be taken, they have to be invigilated, meaning that they're taken at a testing centre, no online home-based tests. Now, AHPRA can accept scores from 2 sittings, but they must be taken within 6 months of each other. And if you previously pass one of the tests and use it to gain registration in a comparable country like the UK, Ireland, the US, AHPRA can accept that test even if it's expired, provided it matched the current scoring standard for AHPRA. Exemptions do exist, but they're extremely strict. You'd need to prove that you had completed all of your primary and secondary education and tertiary education in a recognised English-speaking country, such as the US, UK, Canada, Ireland, or even New Zealand. And you need to provide the school reports and evidence to prove that it was in one of those countries and in English. For most internationally qualified nurses, that simply is too high. And I've had a number of clients argue with me that they did their bachelor's in one of these countries, therefore they should be exempted. That's not how it works. So AHPRA is what you're going to need to practice safely, and their standard is strict. It's non-negotiable, so make sure you're prepared for that. Now the next thing we need to move on to is the migration. So this is the visa English requirements. This is where things get even trickier because English plays a role in 2 different ways. First, it has a basic eligibility requirement, and the second is it could be part of the point space for skilled independent visas under the General Skilled Migration Program. That's points-based. So let's start with the employer-sponsored visas. If you're applying, say, for the subclass 482, Skills in Demand visa, or the subclasses 494 or the 186, that's all employer-sponsored visas, you must meet what's called the Competent English scores. This is actually in the Migration Act. If you don't meet that requirement, you're not eligible to apply and the visa can be refused, even if you have a job offer. Remember, the employer-sponsored visas aren't points-based, so the Competent English doesn't give you any extra point advantage. It's simply getting those scores or not being eligible. Competent English can be proven through one of a number of tests, including the IELTS academic for nurses, that is, not the general, the PTE academic, the OET, the CELPIP general, the MET, the Language Cert International, and the Cambridge C1. Each has its own minimum scores, and importantly, you must meet each of those in the specific bands, and it needs to be taken in person at a testing centre. So invigilated. Home-based tests, again, are not accepted. Now, if we shift into the points-based visas, so that's like the subclass 189, skilled independent, or the subclass 190, that is state nominated, and the 491, again, is a state nominated visa. English tests become strategic. Here's how it works. Competent English is the legal minimum, but it actually gives you 0 points. Now, whilst that makes you eligible, you're very unlikely to be nominated. This is because it's a competitive process. Proficient English gives you 10 points, and for most nurses, this is a more realistic minimum for competitiveness. Superior English, though, earns you 20 points, and for some applicants, this is definitely a deciding factor between being overlooked and securing a nomination. It's not just about the main applicant here. So if you have a partner in this process or you have dependent adults, they also need to prove functional English. This is both for the employer-sponsored and the skilled independent visas. Otherwise, you're going to be hit with a second visa application installment. This charge is currently $4,890 per person. So if your partner and you have one adult child and they don't prove through a test functional English, you're looking at almost $10,000 added to your application on top of their standard visa fees. Finally, let's talk a little bit about exemptions. For migration, the only real exemption is if you hold a passport from the UK, US, Canada, or Ireland, or potentially New Zealand. But there's a catch. If you rely on an exemption and you're the main applicant, remember, you get 0 points. It's only deemed as competent. In the points-based system, that doesn't really make you competitive. So even if you're exempt, you still should be considering taking a test and preparing so you can boost your overall score and attractiveness for nomination. So the key takeaway here is that the Migration English and AHPRA English are 2 completely separate systems, but you must meet the requirements of both. Now, for the last topic, I want to talk about some of the common mistakes, myths, and also why strategy matters when it comes to your English tests. Let's talk about the mistakes and myths that I see as a lawyer, because this is where nurses can lose time time, money, and sometimes the entire migration opportunity. The first mistake is assuming that AHPRA and migration are the same, that it's part of the whole migration process. They're not. They're actually two totally different systems. So I can talk about the AHPRA system because I'm a lawyer, whereas a migration agent can't because it's not part of a migration. So passing a test for one stage doesn't mean you've passed it for the other. The second mistake is booking the wrong test type or the wrong version. I've had nurses who sat for the IELTS General. You need the IELTS Academic. That will not count for your AHPRA, and for migration processes, they're expecting a skilled professional like you to take the academic. Or they sit for the at-home version of the test, which is not accepted for AHPRA or migration. You always need to check that you're booking the right kind of test so that you have the correct documentation, and it needs to be delivered in an approved testing center. The third mistake I see is people just aiming for the minimum. Yes, competent English scores may get you over the line for some processes, but if you're talking about skilled migration, it doesn't give you any points. So if you're really serious about migrating independently, you need to be aiming for at least proficient, if not superior, to stay competitive. The fourth mistake I see is people assuming exemptions. So maybe you do meet exemption requirements for AHPRA, but that doesn't mean that carries across to the migration process, because they're two separate areas of law. I've seen too many people confused about this, and they don't like doing the English test. Of course, no one does. I understand that. But don't dig your heels in and get stuck because you weren't prepared to take a test when you needed to. The fifth mistake is forgetting about family members. If you have a partner or you have dependent adult children and they don't meet functional English, you're going to be charged nearly $5,000 per person in addition to their visa fees. And there's something most people don't realize. For migration, English test requirements are often a time of application requirement. That means you need to have had those scores before you even lodge your visa application. If you don't, the visa application will be refused. You can't just do it later during the process. And there is no refund of fees. There's no appealing this process. I've sadly had to represent families who are in this exact situation. One family did end up losing close to $10,000 because they hadn't planned for their dependents' English tests. So this is why strategy matters. When my team and I work with nurses, we're not just looking at whether or not you've passed. We're looking at whether you have had the right test, the right version, you have the right scores, you have the right dates that's going to be accepted, whether or not you're competitive, if you're looking to be nominated. And we're also planning ahead for your partner and your dependents so you're not hit with unexpected fees or potential refusals. The best part is you don't have to figure this out all on your own. We've actually partnered with an accredited English test preparation provider. So they are officially recognized by most of the major testing organizations. Most commonly, we see nurses do this for IELTS, OET, and the PTE academic. That means they have the most up-to-date marking rubric. They're not just guessing. They're not just giving a quick fix with tips from YouTube. They're trained. They've got over 20 million migrants worldwide, and the cost of their preparation courses is often less than the English test. So if you look at needing to retest to get the right scores, that's far more stressful and more costly in the long run. Don't risk failed attempts. Don't book tests before you're ready. It just doesn't make sense. Get the right preparation partner. So if you'd like to access support, I am going to pop a link for them in today's show notes so you can check that out. All right, now let's recap. In today's episode, we covered off three things. Firstly, we talked about the new AHPRA English requirements that were introduced in March 2025. There's 5 accepted tests, and there was slight changes to the actual scores around writing to bring it in line with other comparable jurisdictions. Secondly, we looked at the migration or the visa English rules, where there was employer-sponsored visas, where you require competent English, or the points-based tests, which reward higher English scores with more points, which makes you more competitive. We also touched on the functional English requirement for partners and dependent family members over the age of 18. Thirdly, we went through common mistakes and myths, from assuming that AHPRA and migration are one and the same to aiming too low and overlooking dependence, and why strategic preparation is key to success. All right, if today's episode has left you thinking, I really need to get things right, you're not alone. English testing is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for nurses migrating to Australia, but it doesn't have to be with the right preparation. To find out more about our accredited English preparation partner, please do check the link that I've put in today's episode show notes. If you're now at the stage of planning your full migration pathway from AHPRA registration through to the visa strategy, my team at Solvi Migration is here to guide you every step of the way. Please go ahead and book a consultation with the team at www.solvi.com.au. Once again, thank you for joining me on Making Australian Migration Easy. I'm Rhea Fawole. Until next time, please like, subscribe, and share, and I look forward to seeing you next time.